and welcome to The Appointment. I'm Pranjal Sharma. Joining me today for a conversation is Sujoy Ghosh, who's the country head India for First Solar. Sujoy, thank you for being with us today. You are amongst the biggest solar companies in the world. Tell us a little bit about what First Solar has been doing in India so far.
Thanks, Pranjal, for having us on the show. First Solar started off its India journey in December 2011. We have two lines of businesses. Primarily in one, we sell our modules to other developers, and additionally we also create utility scale solar projects by bringing in our equity and building projects and de-risking them from a construction, financing and technology standpoint. Today we are one of the largest providers of technology in the Indian market. We have 1.3 gigawatts of installed thin film solar modules in the country. Out of that, about a gigawatt of that capacity has been what we sold to other developers starting from 2011. And more recently, beginning of 2014, we've started to develop our own assets.
You said that you're also developing solar power, but give us a sense and understanding of when you say you are making modules for solar generation. What does it mean for a person who's not aware of what solar panels are all about?
Our company makes what is called thin film solar modules.
Right.
80% of the world's solar modules are made using silicon as the core semiconductor material. First Solar uses a very different semiconductor called cadmium telluride, which we use in very small quantities, doping a very thin film of that product onto a piece of glass, and it is photosensitive, which means that when light falls on the panel, it produces electricity. The electricity produced is in DC, and then if you're using these panels for generating power and selling it to the grid, you use inverters and other equipments to convert to AC and then inject energy into the grid, right? Our technology remains differentiated, A, from the material usage, but B, the semiconductor also responds much better in Indian climatic conditions, which are hot and humid. So typically all semiconductors degrade when they're subject to high temperature, which is why if you look at your computers and other devices, you need cooling to.
But you don't need that.
No, none of the panels need that, because they're meant for outdoor operations and they're meant to actually see the sun for the best part of the day. But all these panels degrade, their conversion efficiency degrades when they are subjected to higher temperatures. Our technology degrades at a rate which is half of conventional silicon, and then it responds much better to diffuse light and also to light which is coming through the moisture in the atmosphere, which is what you see on cloudy days.
When you started in India, what kind of momentum did you have, and in the last few years have things changed radically for you? You say that you have the largest share in the Indian market. How difficult or exciting has been the journey?
The journey in India has been very exciting for us. We came into the country, as I said, around the later part of 2011, which was the time the first round of the National Solar Mission was being bid out. The then program was to build about 10 gigawatts of solar capacity in 7 years' time. After 2014, when the new government came in, they scaled the program up to 100 gigawatts. And this kind of dramatic scale up in demand, backed by complementary changes in policy and regulation, at least at the central level, has made India one of the fastest growing markets for solar in the world today. That's the first good thing about India. The second thing is, for us, our technology, given the differentiated material we use, performs much better as compared to conventional solar panels in Indian climatic conditions, giving us about 5 to 9% higher energy for the same capacity installed in India. And that helps us to demonstrate a lower life cycle cost to our asset owners.
In these 5 years, how has the atmosphere changed for you in terms of your client base, your own generation? What would you say have been the milestones?
The major turning point was August 2014, right, when the Modi government came in and they scaled up the solar program to 100 gigawatts. I think that was a significant turning point for India, for not just the solar industry internationally, but also for the utility industry in India, where you suddenly had renewables come into the mainstream. So all the thinking around transmission capacity and how do you do your regulations to enable this kind of growth in renewables underwent a lot of change.
So when you say thinking changed, where did the thinking change? Did it change in the state electricity boards? Did it change in the existing power utilities? Did it change in the minds of the investors, consumers? Where did all this change happen?
Across every aspect of the value chain, across all of those elements, what you said. Primarily, the thinking changed first at the central government level, where the central government came out with a larger plan. But India, as you know, power is a concurrent subject, so the bulk consumer of power is the state electricity boards. And so we saw a lot of the states and the political establishment in the states also aligning themselves to the central government's plan for this kind of sustainable development.
Did that surprise you?
It did not. And the reasons are very simple, right? I mean, if you look at 2014, we were having major concerns around energy security, given the fluctuating prices of coal, the low production of coal, and the fact that we were over-dependent as a country on baseload thermal generation coming from coal. In addition to that, there were challenges which was being encountered by everyone around the impacts of global warming. And I think the third thing was that we had a problem of energy access in India, where we had a significant amount of our population living without access to energy. And solar, in particular, renewables in general, did address some of these concerns, which was very typical for India. And I think, so therefore, we saw a lot of states quickly aligning their own renewable procurement obligations to match what was the target set by the center.
Sujoy, you've been telling us about the turning point where people suddenly realize that solar doesn't have to be on the fringe. It is in effect coming to the mainstream of India's energy consumption basket. Was it also good timing in some ways, apart from the fact that the Narendra Modi government made a big push on this, that there was a coal shortage in India and people thought that perhaps renewables and solar was the shining knight in white armor? Is that something that happened really?
Well, I would say good timing from an international standpoint, because the solar industry historically was serving Europe. And round about the 2009-10 timeframe, we saw economic contraction in Europe, which directly impacted the very high subsidies the Europeans were paying for solar power, which was inherently expensive at that point in time as compared to normal options they had on the grid, right? That caused a glut in the solar manufacturing side of the value chain, which caused a decline in equipment pricing. And that was round about the time the Indian industry was scaling up. And so there was a benefit to the developers, which saw tariffs in solar reduced from 17 rupees 91 paise in 2010 to now bids coming in at 4 rupee 34 paise. And no other industry has witnessed probably such a dramatic decline in tariffs in the power sector as solar has.
So that made people, especially in the state governments, more comfortable with solar?
Absolutely. I think, as with any commodity, in a macro environment where we still have demand and supply imbalance, we have more demand than supply. As soon as the pricing becomes more competitive, people would, demand would increase, and that's exactly what happened with the solar industry as states became more and more comfortable that this is not going to impact their ARRs. However, Pranjal, as you would know, I think the problem in our country has never been generation capacity. It's always been the financial health of the distribution companies, which are the primary consumers for any form of power. And so we've seen a lot of stranded assets in the thermal side of the business. And more recently, we've seen in wind projects where developers having operating assets have been asked to back down because the distribution companies are unable to procure the energy, even though it's available at a competitive price. And I think that remains probably a larger challenge for the sector overall. Yes, the government has recently come out with the Uday scheme, which in my mind would be the second turning point, which tries to address the root of the problem, which is the imbalance in the finances of the distribution company.
At least clean up the books of the state electricity boards.
Absolutely. And I think the future growth of not just the solar industry, but the overall thermal generation industry would be dependent upon the success of the Uday scheme, and also on the ability of the grid to be built fast enough to take care of this sudden increase in the capacity.
In the mind of the consumer of electricity, the institutional or the individual consumer, today it doesn't really make a difference, because if I switch on the light, the power comes. I don't really care where it comes from, whether it's from hydro, whether it's solar, or whether it's thermal and coal fired. Is there a need for in India for the consumer to be aware? Do you think that will make a difference in terms of the demand, in terms of the clean energy that is option for consumers? Does that make a difference?
Well, so the way the electricity market is structured in India, the primary consumer is the bulk consumer, which is the distribution companies.
Right.
And distribution companies are obligated under the Renewable Purchase Obligations under the Electricity Act to procure a certain percentage of the solar energy on an annual basis. So there's already an awareness created. Retail consumers is a very different thing, right? Retail consumers today, we see a segment which is emerging, which is the residential segment, where people historically used to take inverters for backup power. I think now they're moving and switching options to solar and using the solar panels to charge inverters.
Is that something which you see as an important segment of the overall market?
Well, right now, just given the scale at which the bulk projects are happening, the retail end of solar is going to remain very small. The challenge for the retail end is going to be how do you scale it and how do you attract institutional capital? Because solar is capital intensive, it's all front loaded capital. And unless you have low cost financing, the retail segment will not really develop.
But in theory, it is possible in the coming years for, let's say, the entire the housing market or the commercial real estate companies to possibly have an institutional arrangement with developers like you?
Yes, in theory it's possible. I would say one more thing which would add to that would be the emergence of storage. Right. Because as soon as you have storage which is available at competitive rates, solar is extremely scalable, right? So you can build solar plants and for like 1 kilowatt, right? And you can build solar plants for hundreds and hundreds of megawatts. So you could have individual consumers creating their own energy, but as long as they're able to store it and become independent from the grid, then you would see that segment also, becoming something of scale.
What is the turnaround time and the effort for setting up a solar power farm for, let's say, 1 megawatt from concept to finish when it starts generating?
Well, these days, from concept to finish would be about 12 to 15 months for large-scale solar projects. The biggest time, ironically, is taken in acquiring land and acquiring the right-of-way for the transmission corridors to connect the plant to the grid.
The evacuation
lines. I think constructing the solar plant, as long as you have possession of land, people do 1 to 2 megawatts in a week. So the plants can come up very quickly.
So the plant itself takes only a couple of weeks, but it's the land acquisition and taking the power from the plant to the grid,
yes,
which is a problem.
And it's not a problem, but those are things which take longer. The third thing which takes a lot more time is the financing arrangements. And so you have to work your way through getting the loan documents done, getting all the diligence done from the lenders, which takes time, because most large projects developers bring in the equity capital, which is about 30%. And the balance 70% is available from banks on long-term financing. But raising that capital does take more time than.
So, Joe, you've been talking about the very interesting time that you can set up a solar plant for in as little as 2 weeks, but taking that power which is generated to other parts is a challenge. Now, Prime Minister Modi has talked about a very ambitious solar program, and I think he displayed some of that as the Chief Minister of Gujarat as well. How much time will it take, or how soon can we reach these targets which have been set out for the government and the industry?
So the target right now is 100 gigawatts by 2022. We are at 8,000 megawatts or 8 gigawatts of installed capacity as of September of this year. So there is another 92 gigawatts to go between now and 2022, which is fairly ambitious. Is it impossible? Answer is no. The demand is there. The rationale for doing solar is there. I think a couple of things. One, the the center and the state alignment on policy and regulations is very important. Second is the ability of the stakeholders to build the transmission capacity, and so a lot of the transmission capacity is built by the central agencies like Power Grid, and then there is a lot of state-owned transmission capacity which has to come up. Now, if you're aware of it, there is a Green Corridor program which the government has also announced in 2010, which was meant to create a high-capacity transmission backbone from Rajasthan all the way down to Tamil Nadu, which would then evacuate solar and wind from various pockets where you've got good resource and allow them to come on this highway, which then can be off-taken by various consumers. And I think the Green Corridor activity needs to be accelerated. The other issue in terms of building out this capacity would be availability of financing, right? Now, the good news on that front is we see India as one of the fastest growing markets for solar. We also see traditional markets like Europe and China slowing down in terms of its capacity addition. And so we see a lot of capital, equity capital, from large European utility players, all of who've announced that they're not going to build any more thermal capacity as part of the COP21 deliberations, invest that equity into renewables, because that's the only natural option left for them to continue growing the revenue base. And we see a lot of that capital come into India. The government, to its credit, has done a fantastic job of creating the solar parks policy, where the government steps in, buys land, builds an infrastructure, and offers a developed site for an investor to come in and start building, right? And oh, by the way, they also have NTPC, who is one of the most bankable companies in India, be the off-taker of that energy.
Correct.
So that helps reduce the cost of capital. It also makes foreign institutional investors, foreign utilities comfortable.
So money is not a challenge
I would say it's a challenge, but we're seeing the government take steps
to make sure that it's
make foreign
takeover.
investors comfortable to invest in solar by de-risking some of the traditional risks.
So the land, because solar would mostly come up in areas which are arid, dry, and probably there is no agriculture there,
Right.
because you don't, as you were mentioning, you don't really need to have fertile lands for solar.
Right.
But bringing it and connecting it to the grid is the challenge. So the capacity of Indian agencies to be able to connect solar plants to grid, that speed would be the only challenge, or could be the booster for reaching the target.
Absolutely. I think the ability of the authorities to create those transmission interconnects along with the solar parks is where
So would this be Power Grid Corporation or local?
predominantly Power Grid, and some of it is local, but mainly Power Grid, because these are very large capacity substations, 400 kV and above, which is predominantly done by Power Grid.
You manufacture in India.
Right. We don't.
You don't.
No.
But what about the whole concept of Make in India? How does that fit into your plans?
So, Make in India, from our perspective, has done a lot to change the perception of India being a difficult place to do business. It's, I think, clearly created awareness around ease of doing business. And again, this is again an effort where center and states have to be in tandem. We've seen permitting of solar projects in certain states become very simple as they move to electronic approvals. I mean, states like Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Punjab have
That's ease of doing business.
yeah,
also.
so the ease of doing business part of it has been addressed by Make in India so far. What we think has still some distance to be covered is the competitiveness of the investment in India, right? And so manufacturing in India has to be for the world and not just for manufacturing in India only for India, because the domestic market, at least for solar panels, is not that big enough to justify large scale manufacturing.
Not yet.
Not yet, because you have a lot of capacity in other parts of the world also.
So what would it take for companies like you to invest in manufacturing in India?
Well, we continue to evaluate India as a destination because the global solar, the solar segments growing from about 65 to 70 gigawatts per year to about 100 gigawatts by 2022. So the world would need fresh manufacturing at some point in time. But these are extremely capital intensive. And from our standpoint, our biggest manufacturing is in Malaysia, incidentally. And then we have a manufacturing base in the US also. When you look at India, it has the tax rates of a mature economy and accompanied by very high rate of inflation. right? Now, when you look at any other destination, you have either or of these two, right? I mean, either you have a tax-free zone with a high inflation rate, which is what we see in ASEAN countries, or in more mature markets like the US or Europe also, where manufacturing is being planned right now by other companies. While you see a high corporate rate of taxes, the ability to borrow capital is at a very competitive rate.
So that is the challenge.
So one of them has to give for semiconductor manufacturing to come in on scale in India.
I think that's been a challenge for a long time.
Absolutely.
One final point, Sujoy, where do you see the solar as a percentage of all installed capacity of power in India? What percentage can it possibly reach?
Well, so today we have 300 gigawatts of installed capacity connected on the grid. Solar is 8 gigawatts in that. But by 2022, if the plan of doing 100 gigawatts of solar and an additional 75 gigawatts of wind is achieved, then 40% of India's installed generation capacity will be on renewables. And that's a significant amount of capacity, right? In energy terms, that would mean overall about 12 to 15% of renewable energy on the grid at any given point in time. And that's a fairly significant milestone.
Thanks, Sujoy, and that gives you a lot of work to do in the next few years.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you're looking forward to it, but thanks very much for joining us on the show and sharing your plans and your ideas with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranjal. Thanks a lot.